Hello, and welcome to my vlog over chapter 7. So, today we're going to be talking a little bit about nature and revelation and how or why those two are related, or why not, why they're not related to each other, maybe, depending on what kind of Christian you are. Again, maybe you're picking up a theme here that, like, Christians over time have lots and lots of different ideas about how to relate all of these things. Now, this goes back to some of the issues that we've talked about before, even all the way back to discussions of relating Christian and non-Christian culture. And it overlaps with that because sometimes the distinction between revelation and the natural, so revealed knowledge and natural knowledge, overlaps with the distinction between Christian culture and non-Christian culture. That would make sense since revealed knowledge would be accessible internal to Christian culture, whereas it wouldn't be internal to wouldn't be in the non-Christian culture, right? So in part, you're going to see there are overlapping themes with that discussion. There's also an overlap here in that there's a tension between two notions in Christianity. One is the emphasis of the one God of Christianity, that there is one God and that God must be the God of all of creation. And so since that God is the God of all creation, there can't be competing principles. That God created everything and everything was good. And so if this is true, then it will run in the direction of, it will make pressure for all of nature and all of creation to speak of that divine presence, the divine creator. And on the other hand, the emphasis on the distinctive revelation in the relationship between God and Israel, and especially in the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus as a kind of appearance of God, manifestation of God, the incarnation of God in the world, that a particular group of people at a particular time in history actually gets a special kind of information about God. And then the question, of course, runs on: is there a continuing special revelation, or was that it? Was Jesus it? To do right? And we ran it. I already mentioned that as being an issue in the early church. How far are you going to let special revelation get you? And eventually, the church kind of cracked down on that as it sought to centralize authority and establish what orthodoxy was in a way that people couldn't just come along and articulate new revelations. So there's a tension between these two: the universalism of God as the universal creator of nature, and the particularity of revelation in a particular covenant with a group of people, Israel, and in relation to Jesus as the incarnation. Now, in the textbook, it's picked up a particular way of talking about this, which is there's natural knowledge and there's revealed knowledge. I'm not particular to that way of talking about things. You'll notice that I kind of messed it up earlier when I was saying that. The way I'm more used to talking, I guess, is in terms of general and special revelation. So there's a general revelation that happens through the creation. That's a part of revelation, right? Because God is said to reveal himself in the things that God creates. So it's a revelation, but it's a general revelation. A revelation that's available to the public, that's available out to people all over the place. So it's a general revelation. And then special revelation. Special revelation is a revelation to a particular person, group of people at a particular time that they have access to. So those are two ways to think about it. You could think about it as natural knowledge and revealed knowledge, or you could think about it as general revelation and special revelation. These are all terms that different Christians have used at different times in the history of Christianity, and sometimes at the same times. McGrath uses one category, I tend to use the other. So let's talk about a little bit of the distinction and how we might be able to understand natural knowledge or generally revealed knowledge. So one way is the sense in which you can understand, and this is in the text. It talked a little bit about how the medieval period you understand the cause from the effect of something, right? If all of a sudden my office door flipped open and a ball rolled in, right, I would in fact know something about the cause of that. That presumably somebody had opened my door, possibly a really smart dog. I mean, there's a limit of things that could open my door. The kinds of things that could open my door, and there had to be some pressure pushing on the ball. So we know, like, generally from cause to effect. If we see the effect of something, we see the outcome of something, we can assume something about the cause. And maybe, especially if if the effect is creative, then we can tell even more. So if we think about a painter and a painting, right, you can learn something. As a matter of fact, if you're really well trained at it, you can learn a lot from looking at a painting and figuring out who the painter is. If you're trained in art, you might be able to pick out a particular person that it was. You might be able to pick out what time in their life they actually did this painting, because the creation tells you about the creator. And so this is possible, right, to say, well, the creation, as we are in, the creation of the world, the creation of the universe, maybe all of this tells us about the creator, assuming that there is a creator of the entire thing. Another way that you could think about general revelation is in terms of routine activities. So imagine that you didn't know me, you're unfamiliar with me, but you see me tootling around you see me tootling around campus and doing what I do every day, and you observe me from afar. So we don't engage each other in any way. Maybe I don't even know that you're watching me. But you would see me do a set of things every day, routine things. You would see me go to class. You would see me come out of class. You would see me tie my shoes. You would see, well, I don't have actually shoelaces today. It doesn't make any difference. If I had shoes that had shoelaces, you would see me tie my shoes. You would see me get up in the morning. You would see me go to bed. You would see, right? So you would see a routine set of activities. And even without talking to me, you might be able to learn some things about me. Of course, some things would be ambiguous. You wouldn't know why I do some of the things that I do, because you wouldn't have access to all the information to make sense of it. But you'd see the routine activities that I did every day, and you might be able to develop on that basis some understanding or some knowledge of me. So both of these, if we saw a painting, we can go back to the painter. If we see the routine activities of somebody, we can understand a little bit more about them as a person. But both of these are kind of natural knowledge or special revelation, natural knowledge or general revelations about the person. They are publicly accessible to anybody who comes along. This is different from special revelation. So special revelation would be if you actually talked to the artist, or if you talked to the person that you had been observing going around, and you were able to say, why did you do that? Or maybe the person comes up to you and they explain something about their day and why they do the things that they do, why they painted the picture the way that they did. So in some senses, we can think about the difference between general and special natural knowledge and revealed knowledge in terms of its directness as a form of communication, right? So this allows us at least to make a basic distinction between the two. Special revelation is getting it from the horse's mouth, God's mouth. Right, that there is this revelation that is available, again, in this specific place, in this specific time, as opposed to a kind of more general thing that could be observed by lots and lots of people. Now, in making the distinction between natural and revealed knowledge, or between general and special revelation, there are two things we want to know about this. So, special revelation, yes, special revelation is revelation. It's going to tell us something about what God is. It's going to tell us something about God. But does nature tell us anything about God? Right? So, what information can we get about God from nature, if any? This is a huge argued area. So some people will go with the claims that we saw before, that nature is like a painting, and so we can understand the painter, or that nature is like the routine activities of God, and so we can understand something about God from that. But lots of other people don't think that. They think that nature, in fact, forms a kind of closed system unto itself that runs perfectly well without any account of God. We don't learn anything about God, if God exists, from nature, because nature is just a regular process that continues on its own. And every once in a while, you'll hear this in Christianity too. So the idea that a miracle is God breaking into nature, right? Which is a fascinating idea, because it raises the question, like, does nature exist independent of God? That God has to break into nature, that God has to violate the way that nature works in order to interact with it. So does that mean that usually nature runs independent of God? Now, I mean, again, there are lots of Christian ways of thinking about this. Some of them said, back before there was as much of a distinction between the natural and the supernatural, really, even all the way back in the biblical period, there's no clear distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Miracles are not conceived of in the New Testament as violations of the independent natural world, but as actions of power, right, that show that you are in tune with the powers that run the world, and ultimately kind of everything is God. God is running the world. God runs the world regularly. God, sometimes doesn't run the world regularly, but God's like involved in all of that. But so especially today, especially after we've come through the development of a clean distinction between the natural and the supernatural, it becomes possible to question whether nature does in fact reveal anything about God, just in general, whether there is any such thing as a general revelation, or whether nature in some sense maybe is associated with the world, right? Maybe even that nature is a kind of cruel reality that human beings have to face, and that God provides them an alternative way of dealing with the world. So depending how dualistic you want to get, how much you want to distinguish between and set these things against each other, you could go in different directions. But another question, so that's the question I think that the chapter focuses most on, is that question of whether nature reveals God, and how much nature can reveal God. But there's another question that's also tied up in this, and that has to do with us as natural creatures. So one question is whether nature reveals God. Another question is whether we as natural creatures can receive the revelation, whether we can see what's going on and gather the information about God, even if it's there available for us in some way. So you can think about somebody who's colorblind, right? And even though the wavelengths of light are there, the person isn't set up in order to process the information, be able to gather the information. And of course, this becomes complicated in Christianity because there's multiple senses of natural in Christianity. In some sense, the natural state of Christians is to be pure, to be like Adam and Eve were to start out with, right? So there's no necessity of sinning. There's no issue with them. They could presumably see things fairly well from the beginning. But then there's a second nature, which comes about with original sin. And we'll talk more about original sin as we get into this. But original sin is a kind of power over people that corrupts their actions, but also corrupts how they see the world, how they see each other, how we see everything around us. And so if we are, in fact, all contaminated by sin, original sin in some sense, that we are biased, that we are turned inwards towards ourselves or towards things other than God, then it raises this question. Can we as natural people, or do we have to be transformed in order to see nature and the information that it could give us about God? So maybe it's the case that nature, in fact, speaks of God, but we're not able to perceive it until we have received a kind of revelation or transformation. So both of those are questions. How much does nature reveal God, and how much are we able to receive that? Now, that said, so these are going to be questions that continue to pop up as we go through. I want to say something about the historical picture of how these go, because I've already mentioned that. Like the distinction between the natural and the supernatural is something that develops as we go through Christianity. It's not something that was immediately obvious to early Christians, that there is such a distinction between the natural and the supernatural. There was much more for them, first Christians, a distinction between, say, Greco-Roman culture and the culture that they're trying to develop as Christians. They wanted to distinguish those two, right? And that comes from a distinction between Gentile culture and Jewish culture that they're working on developing. And actually, that's probably the first context in which this kind of distinction comes up. In Romans, as Paul is trying to expand out, Paul in the Bible, one of the authors of the Bible, author of several letters, conceives himself as an evangelist, somebody bringing the good news to the Greeks, to the Hellenists, to the Gentiles. And so he wants to expand out what had been a typically Jewish concern about obedience to the law, right? The law is a revelation that's given to the Jewish people. But he wants to say, no, everybody has sinned against the law. And so he tries to make the move to say, look, everybody has sinned against the law, which means you can't just have sinned against the special revelation to the Jewish people, because that only is binding on the Jewish people, right? I mean, if the Jewish people receive the law, and they're the only ones who got it, then they're the only ones who are held under it. But Paul comes along in Romans and he says, look, everybody has enough knowledge about God that they know that how they're supposed to behave, how they're supposed to live, enough that they should know that they've already failed in that process. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, says Paul. But this argument depends upon a notion that there is knowledge about God that is generally accessible. Because if everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, then in some sense everyone must have some knowledge about the law and what's required of them to have fallen short of this knowledge. And so we find Paul there referring to an early idea of what becomes the idea of natural law. that there is a kind of natural knowledge of morality and of the divine that's accessible to all people. And he wants to claim, in some sense, that everybody is falling short and that Jesus is the solution to the problem of everyone falling short. Jesus brings about a universal atonement between people. So there's a bit of the distinction, although it's not developed entirely into a supernatural natural distinction. It really is a cultural distinction. Who has access to this particular knowledge? Okay, you missed it, but I just went and taught a different class and then came back. So you might notice like I don't have my sweater on anymore. Things. Anyway, so I wrapped up last just a little bit a second ago for you, talking about Paul and the way that Paul tries to draw together the Gentiles and the Jews by suggesting that everyone has failed in keeping up with the law, keeping up with morality, has failed God in some way. And to do this, he makes a kind of argument that everyone, as a matter of fact, has access to basic knowledge about God, basic knowledge about morality. Another kind of vignette in the history of Christian thinking about the relationship between the natural and the supernatural, this hasn't developed to that point yet, comes about in the Patristic period, where we see a development of several arguments that the world makes most sense if God exists. And as a matter of fact, there's some effects that you can't make sense of without talking about God. So in order to grasp this, it's helpful to know that Aristotle had put forward a theory of the arrangement of the world. He had different, well, you probably are familiar with, there are different materials. So there's like earth, wind, water, fire, earth, wind, water, fire. Yeah, that sounds good. Earth, wind, water, and fire that are kind of basic elements. And Aristotle had posited a universe where basically it was a geocentric, so the world, the earth, is the center of the universe. And basically every direction towards the earth is down. So there's an up and there's a down that are clear. There's an up and there's a down that are clear and real, and we are standing on the earth, right? Which is underneath us, below us, and above us there's air, and he posited that there were kind of four different layers. So earth, dirt, wants to go down. And it's kind of the, if you want to think about it this way, the heaviest thing. So earth goes to the bottom. Water wants to sit above the earth, but below the air. And I mean, this is just a basically like observational theory. So if you take a rock and you drop it in water, where does the rock go? Well, the rock goes to the bottom. It wants to go further down, right? So the water wants to be on top of the rock, and then the air wants to be on top of water. It has this natural location there. So you have earth that wants to fall, water that wants to occupy a middle place, air that then goes above the water, and then there's fire. And where does fire go? Well, if you start a fire, the fire moves up. The fire doesn't move sideways, it moves up. And so the theory was that there's another layer at the top that's fire, that the fire really wants to move through the air upward. And so really we've just got these four different kinds of material stuff. Earth, air, wind, fire, and earth, air, earth, water, air, and fire. There you go. And these are the levels of things. Well, this makes sense of most of our observations as we go around through the world. But they did have this. It didn't make sense of the sun, as a matter of fact, because the sun is fire, so of course it should be above the air in our system. The problem that Aristotle had was making sense of planets. They knew that there were planets, and they knew that the planets were out rotating around, circling around. And so Aristotle had to posit that there was a separate substance, something other than the earth, water, air, and fire. There's some third substance that's out there that these planets are made of, and they can't be made of material like rock or anything like that, because if they were, they would fall down, right? But most people recognize that this was a kind of a problem in his theory, because there was no way to observe these other planets. There was no way to actually check this out. And so some early Christian philosopher came along and he said, no, this makes perfect sense. He says, yeah, the other planets are made of Earth, just as our planet is. And the question that you have to address is like, why do they then, or how are they able to stay out from falling down into the earth? And he said the only answer for this, the only good answer, is that God continues this happening. So if I had here, right, a marker, and if I wanted it, if as a person, as an agent, I wanted it to defy gravity, I could make the marker defy gravity. I could do that by throwing it up in the air, right? And so he said, well, this makes sense of why the planets continue to keep their orbit. It's basically because God is pushing them, right? So God keeps the planets in their orbit. And so this can show you how, in some sense, we're starting to get this distinction between God's action and nature, right? But God is the cause that's necessary for nature to have. So nature depends upon the divine in order to keep running in the way that it does. It depends upon the divine. And so even though we're getting a separation between kind of nature and there are natural forces, as opposed to just God is involved in everything, the divine is necessary in order to run everything. During the medieval period, we continue to develop this, and this is where they do get a separation between the supernatural and the natural, and really do develop that. And in your reading, you can see from Thomas Aquinas doesn't see these, does see the natural and the supernatural. He does see them separate. But he organizes them and says, well, we have cause and effect. And so by studying the effect, nature, we can know something about the cause. And you can see that working its way back to the idea that God is God is causing things to happen internal to nature. God is causing this. Also, Thomas Aquinas comes along and he says, well, the relationship between natural knowledge and revealed knowledge is easy enough. The revealed knowledge perfects natural knowledge, but it doesn't ever contradict it, because God is the thing that created the creation, right? And God is the thing that reveals himself in the New Testament, in Jesus' Acts, in the Old Testament. And so everything that's revealed, in fact, just takes what we could know on the basis of nature and takes it further. It perfects it, but it doesn't ever contradict it, right? So the natural knowledge and revealed knowledge are basically a continuation of the same thing. There's no contradiction between them. It's just like seeing me walking around and then asking me why I'm doing the things that I do. Nothing I say is going to contradict what I did. You're going to be able to get a better picture of what I'm doing by listening to me tell you, but I'm not going to contradict anything that I did when I was acting, or at least if I'm a coherent person, if I'm a rational person. And of course, God is the source of reason. So there's a perfect fit between natural knowledge and supernatural knowledge. At least that's the way that they thought about it through the medieval period. But they had come up with this distinction, the natural, supernatural distinction, and eventually the Reformation will push against this, in part with the emphasis on sola scriptura, the idea that we can only gain knowledge from Scripture alone. There is the idea that we have to emphasize the role that is played by the distinctive revelation in Jesus, in the Bible, and that any human construct, which includes the church now, any human construct, human history, human philosophy, just fails really to get at the truth of what is divinely revealed. And so it's really at the Reformation where we start to see a clash between, or the idea of a clash between reason and nature on the one hand, and faith and revelation on the other hand, and pressing those against each other. In part, that draws upon those distinctions from early on between the Greco-Roman and Jewish society that early Christianity was drawing on. But here it's put forward in a very new way, the idea that there is a fundamental clash between nature and revelation. Now, by that, none of the reformers really mean that. There's a fundamental clash between the truth of nature and the truth of revelation. But they will emphasize that nature is corrupted by sin, such that, so not only we are corrupted by sin, by original sin, and we can't see clearly. So any human view or human institution that tells you about nature or tries to understand things through nature, it's corrupt and it won't be able to see clearly. But also that nature is corrupted by sin. This is an idea that goes all the way back to Augustine and possibly back even further, or you can find nascent ideas of it in the scriptures. The idea that the creation itself is corrupted by sin. So if you look at, say, Isaiah, read Isaiah through this, Isaiah imagines the final coming of the summation of the world, the end times, when the lion will lay down with the lamb, right? And the lion and lamb are, in nature as we know it, competitors with each other, right? So why is it that nature would change in this way, right? Well, one answer is that nature has been corrupted by sin, so that it put animals fighting with each other instead of harmonious with each other, cooperative with each other. And so nature as we have it in the world is always corrupted by sin. We are corrupted by sin, so we don't see clearly. And the nature we have access to in the world is corrupted by sin, so that it doesn't give us a true picture of what God is like. We don't gain immediately from the kind of image of nature a deep knowledge about God and God's intentions. These come to be in contrast in the Reformation. Now, of course, the modern period, these become even more estranged from each other oftentimes, in part because we get the development of this particular way of reading the Bible that I talked about in the last video lecture, where the tendency is to take the Bible literally, get rid of the allegorical and symbolic and typological readings of the Bible, and then say, well, the Bible, as a matter of fact, we can read it as a science textbook. And so the ways that the world is portrayed in the Bible, Christians always have to believe exactly that. Which, again, prior to this, Christians had more flexibility about. And then in reaction to that, the development of modern science and modern rationalism that looks at that way of reading the Bible and says, well, if this is the way we have to read the Bible, then the Bible simply isn't true. And this comes to undermine, so the arguments that God was necessary to the functioning of the world are typically undermined in modern science. In part, the idea that you needed an agent in order to keep the planets up and running around the world, for instance, that comes to comes into question, seriously comes into question, with the work of Galileo and Newton. I mean, this is why Galileo was such a controversial figure in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Renaissance, is because Galileo is starting to lay out a picture where, like, guess what? That picture that you've embraced for so long, where the earth, the world is, the earth that you know is the bottom of the world, and there are these four layers, and then God has to be active in keeping the planets going around. That doesn't work. As a matter of fact, the sun is central to even our own galaxy. And then by the time we get to Newton, we get the development of theories of gravity. Now, realize it's not new that, say, objects fall. Everybody knew that all the way back. Aristotle knew that. He had a theory about why things fell. So that's not what they found out. The stupid story about Newton and the apple falls on his head, and he's like, oh my gosh, there must be gravity, as if nobody before that realized it. I mean, that's kind of absurd. But what Newton does is he gives a name to an abstract, impersonal force that could explain how all of the different bodies of material in the universe relate to each other, so that we don't have to have an account of a personal agent keeping everything going, right? And then, of course, another argument that people use for the necessity of God relating to nature was the idea that you couldn't have complex biological beings like we are or like other animals are. They wouldn't develop on their own. They wouldn't develop randomly, right? And in part, Darwin comes along with his theory, and his theory is, interestingly enough, developed on the back of a lot of natural theology, about the idea that this is like ideas that this is how God, in fact, was kind of ordering things. That God ordered the world so as to keep people moving, keep people motivated. And so like laziness, stagnation would in fact lead to punishments for people. That was one of the natural law theories that Darwin is really familiar with, and develops into this theory of natural selection. That if a species doesn't change, right, it will end up going out of existence. And this is developed off of natural theology theories, that this is how God motivates change and improvement in the world. Prior to Darwin, most Christians accepted some theory of evolution in the sense that things in the world changed over time. Just look at the question of how people come to have different skin tones, right? Lots of Christians, even biblical literalists before Darwin, would have said, well, of course, there's a process of evolution. We come from Adam and Eve, say. And Adam and Eve obviously have one set of skin tones, but different people develop different skin tones as they spread out throughout the world. So most Christians prior to Darwin actually believed some theory of evolution, but Darwin comes in and he gives the account of natural selection. The idea that maybe randomly some things continue surviving under certain environmental conditions, whereas others don't. And this gives rise to, over time, incredibly slowly, complexity. And so we could, in fact, have whole types of people, whole species that evolve on the basis of random chance. And so this got rid of another place where some Christians had grounded their natural theology to say, well, this is a place where we must need God. You need God in order to explain it. So in part, we have this development of then two different kinds of Christianity, the kind of Christianity that went with the fundamentalists, kind of literalist reading of Scripture, that then said, well, we've come to a contradiction with modern science, which says that things developed over a long period of time, whereas the Bible says 6 days. And we need to stick to that as opposed to science. And so here there's a faith-science divide that comes up. And then there's modernist Christians who say, well, no, we're going to continue reading the Bible as like symbolic, and we don't have a problem with these scientific theories. And so there's a question, is there a split between these two? Are they saying things that are fundamentally opposed to each other? Or are they compatible with each other? And a lot of the work of late modernity was put into developing different models that you saw in your reading, that suggest either that these two could be complementary or they ought to be divided. They're talking about different things, etc. And that's part of the work of late modernity. And right now, in part, we're passing into postmodernity. And postmodernity does a couple of different things. One is it questions the confidence of scientists that science has been able to produce a coherent account of the world. As a matter of fact, I think most scientists would accept that they haven't been able to produce. Lots of them there's a lot of work in physics after a kind of one coherent theory of everything, but nobody's been able to actually knock that down. There are also questions, I think, that postmodernity would ask about things like evolution and how much evolution can explain, not to throw out all of evolutionary theory, certainly. The same way postmodernity questions us, or leaves us questions about how much we should believe in any one particular reading of the Bible, or have confidence in any particular way that we go about reading the Bible. Now, postmodernity also goes in other directions. There's some versions of it that are communitarian, that say we'll just believe whatever our community believes about this or about that. And some of those communitarian models of Christianity then redevelop a distinction between, say, natural knowledge and supernatural knowledge. So supernatural knowledge or revealed knowledge is available internal to the Christian community. And so in some ways that's going back to some of what was going on in the first century, although there's a tendency to pick up with the Reformation idea that natural knowledge needs to be rejected, but true knowledge comes through the community. And it's only through the community that you can actually understand nature properly then. And we find that in a couple of contemporary theologians, especially influenced by Karl Barth, who will come up again and again in your reading. Stanley Hauerwas, who was once named the most important theologian in America by Time magazine, who is a communitarian theologian, postmodern communitarian theologian. So there's moves like that. Now, so postmodernity works in multiple directions. It could break down lots of barriers and try and prompt everyone to become more humble about every claim to knowledge, whether you're a scientist or a person of faith. It could push you into more communitarian versions of knowledge where you just rest your claims in the claims of your particular community. It could develop in lots of different directions. And so today, what we work through in terms of the relationship between the natural and the revealed, the natural and the supernatural, we're still dealing with some of that leftover of modernity. You'll still come across scientists who believe that like science and faith are conflicting and there's no way to sort them out and science is right. You'll still come across some of those who believe in the conflict and believe that faith is absolutely right. And you'll come across figures that want to have mixtures of these different things, figures that are pushing for greater humility, people that are pushing for a greater sense of stake in community claims. So that's where I'm going to wrap up my comments on nature and revelation, nature and the supernatural. And I'll come back next time and talk a little bit more about the relationship between faith and philosophy, which again keeps working on these basic themes.